Every time you hop into your modern tractor's comfortable cab, you're sitting in the result of decades of hard lessons learned. The safety features we take for granted today came at a steep price, one paid by generations of farmers who worked with machines that could turn deadly in an instant. Speaking of safety, the hand crank starter might just be the most notorious feature in tractor history. You've probably heard stories from old-timers about these mechanical menaces. One wrong move and that innocent-looking crank could snap back like a steel cobra, shattering wrists and breaking arms in the blink of an eye. Farmers called it the arm breaker for good reason. The real danger came from the engine's compression. If it kicked back during starting, that crank would spin backward with devastating force. Some farmers developed special techniques, keeping their thumb on the same side as their fingers to avoid a broken thumb. But even the most experienced operators couldn't eliminate the risk entirely. When electric starters finally became standard in the 1950s, you'd think every farmer would have jumped at the upgrade. But many stuck with their hand crank models, either from habit or necessity. It wasn't until a new generation of farmers took over that these dangerous starters finally began disappearing from fields across America. Next up are the tricycle-style front ends, a feature that proved just how quickly a normal day could turn tragic. These narrow front tractors were incredibly popular for row crops, letting farmers navigate tight rows with precision. The problem? They were about as stable as a three-legged stool on a hillside. The narrow front wheels created a dangerous center of gravity, and all it took was one slightly too sharp turn or a modest slope to send the whole machine rolling. What made these tractors particularly treacherous was their deceptive nature. They worked perfectly fine on flat ground, giving operators a false sense of security. But at a slight incline, a sudden turn to avoid an obstacle, or an uneven patch of ground, and that same maneuverability became a death trap. Many farmers lost their lives when their tractors flipped, often in situations that seemed perfectly safe moments before. The absence of rollover protection systems, or ROPS, stands as one of the deadliest oversights in tractor design. Before the 1970s, when a tractor flipped, there was nothing between the operator and the ground except open air. Factor in the weight of these machines, often several tons of steel, and you can understand why a rollover almost always meant tragedy. Farm families would share stories of how quickly it could happen. One minute someone would be working their field, the next, they'd be trapped beneath several thousand pounds of machinery. Statistics tell a grim story. Thousands of farmers lost their lives before ROPS became standard equipment. What's particularly striking is how long it took for this simple yet life-saving feature to become mandatory. Even after the dangers were well documented, many manufacturers continued producing tractors without rollover protection, citing cost concerns and customer preferences for unobstructed views. Oh, and real quick, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button. It really helps out my channel. Thanks. Steel lug wheels might look impressive in antique tractor shows today, but when they were common, they were anything but a showpiece. These metal wheels, with their aggressive cleats and bars, were designed for one thing: getting a grip in soft soil. And they did that job remarkably well, maybe too well. The problem started when farmers needed to move their tractors on hard surfaces or paved roads. Picture trying to control a several-ton machine rolling on what amounts to metal spikes. These wheels would skate across paved surfaces, making steering nearly impossible. One slight incline or attempted turn could send the tractor sliding sideways, completely out of the operator's control. Farmers often had to plan their routes carefully, avoiding paved roads whenever possible. The real irony? The better these wheels worked in the field, the more dangerous they became on hard surfaces. Their rigid construction also transmitted every shock and bump directly to the tractor and operator, leading to mechanical failures and operator fatigue. It wasn't until the development of rubber tires that farmers finally got a safer alternative that worked well both in the field and on the road. Long before the standardized PTO shafts we know today, belt-driven systems were the go-to method for powering implements. Picture this: a wide, constantly moving belt, completely exposed, running from the tractor to whatever implement needed power. These belts weren't just any ordinary belts. They were thick, heavy-duty strips that could grab onto anything that came too close. And by anything, I mean clothing, hair, or limbs. The real danger lay in how these belts had to be maintained. Farmers often needed to adjust them while the machinery was running to keep proper tension. One wrong move, one loose piece of clothing, and you could be pulled into the machinery before you even had time to react. Even more concerning was how these belts would sometimes snap under stress, becoming lethal whips that could cause serious injury or death. The exposed nature of these systems meant there was literally nothing between the operator and these dangerous moving parts. What made these systems particularly treacherous was their unpredictability. The belts would stretch and contract with temperature changes and use, requiring constant attention. In wet conditions, they'd slip and squeal, tempting operators to make dangerous adjustments. Many farmers tried creating their own safety shields, but these homemade solutions often proved inadequate against the raw power of these systems. Here's something that might surprise younger viewers. Many older tractors came with an extra seat mounted right on the fender. Sure, it might have seemed convenient at the time, giving farmers a way to train new operators or transport helpers around the farm, but let's be honest, these seats were basically an accident waiting to happen. Think about it. You're perched on a small metal seat bolted to the side of a tractor with nothing but air between you and the ground. No safety belt, no protection, just hanging on while the tractor bounces through fields. The passenger sat right next to spinning wheels and moving machinery parts, often having to constantly adjust their position just to stay on. What made this feature particularly dangerous was how it normalized carrying passengers on equipment that was never designed for more than one operator. These seats became especially popular during harvest seasons when extra hands were needed in the fields. Entire families, including children, would use these fender seats as regular transportation around the farm. Weather conditions made things even worse. A slippery seat from morning dew or rain could turn a routine ride into a disaster. The practice was so common that many farmers didn't even consider it dangerous until accidents started mounting up. If you think modern machinery looks intimidating, imagine working around tractors where massive flywheels and gear systems spun completely in the open. These exposed moving parts were like industrial-strength meat grinders just waiting for a mistake. The flywheels, often spinning at hundreds of RPM, had no guards or shields, just bare metal whirling through the air. What made these features particularly treacherous was their placement. Many were at knee or waist height, right where loose clothing could easily get caught. Farmers would often need to work around these moving parts while the tractor was running, performing maintenance or making adjustments. One moment of distraction, one loose sleeve or pant leg, and you'd be pulled into the machinery before anyone could react. The danger wasn't limited to clothing getting caught. These exposed mechanisms would throw oil, grease, and debris while operating. In winter, ice buildup could shoot off like shrapnel. Even routine maintenance became a hazard. Reaching around these parts while they were stationary was risky enough, but many tasks required the engine to be running. Old-timers would tell stories of learning to work blind, reaching into spaces they couldn't see because looking would mean putting their face too close to moving parts. Before hydraulic power steering became standard, turning a tractor was more like wrestling a bull than steering a vehicle. These purely mechanical systems required immense physical strength, especially when the tractor was stationary or moving slowly. The larger the tractor, the heavier the front end, and the more muscle power needed to turn those wheels. The real danger came from operator fatigue. After hours of fighting with the steering wheel, farmers would become exhausted, leading to slower reaction times and poor decision making. This was particularly dangerous when precise steering was needed most, like working along ditches, near fence lines, or on hillsides. A moment's hesitation or lack of strength to make a quick turn could spell disaster. The physical toll was enormous. Many older farmers still bear the marks of these systems. Shoulder problems, arm injuries, and chronic back pain from constantly wrestling with unassisted steering. The situation worsened when the tractor was pulling heavy implements or working in soft soil. Some farmers would build up momentum before turns because stopping meant having to muscle the wheel around from a standstill. This practice led to its own set of hazards, especially when working in tight spaces or near obstacles. If you think modern fuel injection systems are complex, the simplicity of old gravity-fed fuel systems might shock you, but not in a good way. These systems relied purely on gravity to deliver fuel from a tank mounted above the engine, with no pumps, no safety shutoffs, and absolutely no failsafes. The fuel literally just flowed downhill through basic lines and simple carburetors. The dangers here were obvious but numerous. Any leak in a fuel line meant fuel would not continue flowing until either the tank ran dry or someone noticed the problem. With hot exhaust manifolds and exposed electrical wiring nearby, these leaks were essentially a fire waiting to happen. Even worse, the elevated fuel tanks were often mounted directly above the engine, meaning any fuel leak would drip directly onto hot engine components. What made this system particularly hazardous was its vulnerability to vibration and movement. Every bounce and jolt from rough field work could loosen connections or crack aging fuel lines. Many farmers would discover leaks only after smelling fuel, or in worst case scenarios, seeing smoke. The location of these tanks also meant that checking for leaks often required climbing onto hot engine components, a dangerous inspection process in itself. Modern tractors won't run without someone in the seat, a simple but crucial safety feature that was completely absent in older models. These machines would keep running whether you were in the seat or not, leading to countless accidents. Imagine a tractor continuing to drive forward after throwing its operator, or running while someone was making adjustments underneath. The lack of operator presence meant that tractors could, and often did, continue operating completely unmanned. If an operator fell off or was thrown from the seat, the tractor wouldn't just keep going. It would keep going with all implements still engaged. A runaway tractor with a running PTO or engaged implements was essentially an unmanned weapon moving across the field. This became especially dangerous during common farm tasks like adjusting implements or clearing blockages. Farmers would often leave their tractors running while working around them, leading to tragic accidents when clothing got caught or when tractors unexpectedly moved. The practice of jumping off quick to check something became normalized, despite its obvious dangers. Some farmers would even drop the clutch down with a stick to keep the tractor running while they worked on implements, a practice that could turn deadly if the stick slipped or if the tractor was bumped into gear.